uh, Julia Parrish joining us from the University of Washington. So Julia Parrish is a Lowell A. and Frankie L. Wakefield Professor of Ocean Fisheries Science and the Associate Dean of the College of the Environment at the University of Washington. An elected fellow of ESA and AAAS, she is also the Executive Director of the Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team, also known as COAST, the largest beach bird program in the world. Julia has been honored as a NOAA Year of the Ocean's Environmental Hero and has received a Champions of Change Award at the White House for her leadership in coastal citizen science. COAST has received a United States Fish and Wildlife Service Partner of the Year Award for ongoing work in Alaskan coastal communities. And here to talk more about COAST is Dr. Parrish herself.
Thanks, Chris. Hope everybody can hear me. Certainly as we go through this talk, if you've got a burning question, put it in the chat. Thanks, Michael. Happy to, at the end of the talk, assuming I haven't gone on too long, just unmute yourself to ask questions so I know you're actually out there. So the first thing that I want to say beyond that is a land acknowledgement. I am joining you from Seattle, which is on the traditional lands of the Coast Salish people, and Coast Salish are a set of tribes and bands ringing the Salish Sea. So in Western speak, that's Puget Sound in Washington and the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia. And my program, COAST, ranges very, very widely throughout the Salish Sea, but also along the outer coast and the tribal nations there, on up to the First Nations peoples in Canada and up into the territories of the Alaska Natives, all the way up to Yupik, Cupik, and Inupiat peoples in the Arctic. Okay, so I am going to share my screen here. I know I can do this. Okay, I want to talk to you today about citizen science in the new normal that is in an era of a warming climate, COVID and inclusivity, except I lied when I gave Chris this title. I'm actually not going to talk about COVID because when I tried to smash it in, was too much time. So suffice to say that the effect of COVID on citizen science is quite polarized for a lot of programs. COVID has dialed up involvement because what else is there to do? And so there's really been a movement towards citizen science, particularly for programs that you can do yourself. So it's sort of DIY, whether it's hands-on or online. But for programs where people work in groups and teams, there's actually been the opposite. So participation has gone down. All right. Really, the question that I want you to really think about, the most overarching science question here is, can citizen science be another part of the toolbox of science? And here, when I think about citizen science, and I want you to think about citizen science, please think about two parts of citizen science. One is that unlike classroom work in formal education, citizen science is informal science, and that means that people can choose to join and choose to leave. It's free choice public participation. And what that really means is that you have to attract people because they are interested, because they are motivated to do what you are asking them to do. And so that's very, very different than how we think about traditional science education. Also, that you are providing them with an authentic science experience with scientific outcomes. So outcomes including generation of new knowledge, new concepts, new ways of conceptually modeling systems, and perhaps answers to issues, concerns, or problems. So thinking both about the citizen, and here citizen is citizen of the world, citizen of the ecosystem, citizen of the environment. I very, very much reject the politicization of that word. Okay, so what's the goal of citizen science? I'm a scientist, so my goal is science, is generation of new knowledge, new understanding of the world, just the same way I would do for any of the other types of science that I do. But there are three other goals that I think are really relevant. One is enjoyment. And that's at the individual level. Why join a program? Why do it? Why keep doing something? Because you love it, because you are motivated, because you are interested in it. So enjoyment at the participant level is really important. Also education, lifelong learning. So lifelong, life wide, life deep. Basically, if you're alive, you are learning, even when you're asleep, right? So focusing citizen science on learning, on education is definitely a goal. Also community empowerment. So can the new knowledge being gained in citizen science actually empower communities, give them more ability to take charge of their own backyards? I'm going to talk to you today about the COAST program, Coastal Observation and Seabird Survey Team. You know, when you do citizen science, or in fact anything, you got to have a cool acronym-y name and a cool logo. So we are COAST, and you can check us out at www.coast.org. In COAST, the main thing we do is standardized searches, just the same way you would set things up for transects, field transects, for instance, repeated monthly. They're effort controlled, so we know how many people, we know where people start, we know where they stop, we know the pattern of searching that they use. And they're collecting verifiable data, which we term evidence, which leads to conclusions about what the identity of a beach cast bird, literally a dead bird, a carcass that's been washed in on the tide. So what's it mean to participate in Coast Beach Birds? Our main monthly program teaches real people to go out and survey their beach. So they're choosing their own beach monthly. And when they find carcasses, as you can see in this picture, they are measuring. There are 3 standard measurements that we use. They're also identifying the foot type of the carcass. They are collecting 2 photographs. Here's a belly or ventral shot here. And you can see that all of the photographs have a scale in them and a slate with particular information. So you can get a lot of information just from the photographs. There's a bunch of condition information, and they use a key to dead birds to make the identification. So the evidence that they send in can be used independently to verify the identity that they've made. We also have a special program in Alaska called Die Off Alert. This is a joint program between the Aleut community of St. Paul Island Ecosystem Conservation Program. They run a larger program in the Bering Sea called Bering Watch, and the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council, AMBCC, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this basically distills our beach bird program down into take a really good photograph. So go to the beach, collect the carcasses, bring them up to a safe place. Beaches in Alaska are pretty wild. Put the rulers down, photograph them. You can see Die Off Alert photograph here, and then you can text them to us and we'll take over from there. So it's a way of getting community members all throughout rural Alaska, rural coastal Alaska, to also participate. We also have a marine debris program. I'm not going to talk about that today, just to mention that we do have a debris program that's centered in Puget Sound and then on the outer coast of Oregon. So our beach bird program, we've been running for about 20 years. And we have about 450 sites that we monitor from Mendocino, which is in Northern California. You can see the map on the right here, running up to Cape Flattery, which is on the Macaw Reservation at the northwest tip of the lower 48. Throughout the Strait of Juan de Fuca, picking up Puget Sound. We leap over Canada. We have a sister program there, British Columbia Beach Bird Survey, pick up in Southeast Alaska to the Gulf of Alaska run out the Aleutian Islands to the Commander Islands, which are actually owned by Russia, leap over the Alaska Peninsula into the Bering Sea. That's where the Pribilof Islands are, and then up into the Chukchi Sea and around the corner of the Arctic to Uktiavik, which is our northernmost site. We are in about 90 coastal communities in that geographic range, and all of the people over all of the years have found about 88,000 carcasses representing just over 200 species. So one thing that scientists often say to me is prove it, right? You've got this program, you're collecting all these data, all these people are out there, thousands of people over the years that you've done the work. Prove to me that the data are good. So this is a pie chart of what people say their expertise is when they walk into a training. So we assess that as people walk into a training, and you can see that a very, very thin sliver of people self-identify as an expert birder. Slightly more identify as an advanced birder. So expert plus advanced is about 15%, whereas just about 50% of people either say that they are a beginner or that they have no experience at all, which is always interesting to me. What does that mean? Does it mean they don't know what a bird is? So suffice to say that half the people that walk into a coast training are very, very nervous about their ability to identify birds in any way. This is a graphic that shows you on the x-axis how much experience a coaster has had. That is how many carcasses they found. From zero, they're just starting out, to people who have participated in the program for a long amount of time and have actually found hundreds of carcasses. And on the y-axis, you can see carcass-specific accuracy in percent, right? So how accurate are people, are coasters, at identifying carcasses correctly? Where the intercept, right, which is a modeled thing, would be how good they are at the start. So walking out of a training, approximately 6 hours later, you're theoretically at the intercept. What is that? That's 70%. So 7 out of 10 carcasses you'll get correct just after 5 hours of training. And again, because they collect the evidence and then make a deduction and they give us all that information, we can verify that. But they get better over time. So practice makes perfect. So after about a year, on average, some beaches are very birdy, some are not. So on average over the program, they can push up that accuracy to about 87, almost 90%. So 9 out of 10 carcasses are identified correctly. And that is amazing, not only because it's a damn good statistic, but because the carcasses aren't pristine, right? About 2/3 of the carcasses are going to be ripped apart, either by predators or by scavengers. Okay, so this is a graphic that shows you how long participants last, right? So if they get better over a year, they actually have to last that year. This is a meta-analysis, so it shows lots of different programs, and you can see on the x-axis are dabblers. So this is the percent of people that are one and done. They come one time, they do something, they add data, and they leave. And on the y-axis is persistence through a year of sampling. And each dot here represents a different citizen science program, and they're color coded by the type of program they are. So I want you to look at the purple dots. The purple dots are online citizen science programs that are involved in classification. So these are things that would be, for instance, in the Zooniverse. And you can see that they're in these programs, there are hundreds of thousands of people that participate, but the vast majority of them are one and done. They go, they spend a day, they do some stuff, but nobody or hardly anybody is participating after a year. The yellow programs are hands-on deductive sampling. So people are out there in the environment doing hands-on work. And there you can see that we get a lot of persistence. So when we think about citizen science and across the types of citizen science, from online to in the field, just the way you might be in the research that you're doing, citizen science programs that are hands-on really need people to participate for a while to get better, to hone their skills. And this star is the COAST program, my program. So about 15% of our participants are one and doners, but a little over 50% of them are still going after a year. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about these people, and I'm going to show you a graphic that's a anomaly graphic, and on the left side are responses of new participants, and on the right side are responses of people who have been participating for a year. And they are basically answering the same question: why did you join? Why are you still a member of COAST? And they're free write answers, and we've coded them by things they talk about, or subjects and actions, verbs that they're using. So here you can see when we ask them this question, the subjects they talk about are things like birds, that's obvious, the beach, the environment, the COAST program. They also speak about actions like being outdoors, or helping, or learning, or their enjoyment, or for health. And so new people tend to talk about birds and the environment and learning more, as you can see in this quote, whereas people who have been with us for a year or more talk about doing the COAST program, supporting science. They definitely talk more about being outdoors, monitoring and observing. So they're starting to use the words of science a little bit more. When they talk about themselves and why they joined, they tend to talk more, that is, seasoned coasters tend to talk more about sciencey things, being a survey team member, being a member of the COAST collective, being a data collector or a science team member. Whereas people who are just joining tend to talk more about their credentials. It's important to them to say to us, look, I'm the right kind of person. I have the right credentials. Now, of course, seasoned coasters still have those credentials, but they don't talk about them anymore. So they really shift in their identity and how they're talking about themselves and the program. So with engagement, coasters intensify their connection to the beach. They increase their use of science language. They drop their individual attributes or credentials, but they still stay very social. They talk a lot about friends and family. So this is a graphic of coasters, and each dot represents a number of coasters that fall at the intersection of the mean or average number of partners they have for any single survey that they do over time. And the x-axis is the cumulative number of unique partners. So folks that have been in the program for 5, 10, 15 years will probably have had more partners cumulatively, even if they only go out with one other person at a time. And so you can see that we've divided this, the larger the circle, the more folks that are in at that intersection. And you can see that there are actually a lot of loners in our program, people who go out all by themselves, and that's what they want to do. So they're going out by themselves, and they have relatively few to, in fact, zero cumulative unique partners, because they're always by themselves. But there are a lot of folks that go out in pairs or sometimes trios. They're far more social, as in this trio of people in California. And in fact, some of them, and in fact, the woman in the center of this photograph, are people who bring in lots and lots of others. So they're sort of network people, they're nexus people, they're just scooping up people in the community, and they're also training those people. So COAST is a very, very social kind of intersection. And we actually did a network analysis to see how connected people are to each other in COAST. And this is the largest network when we look at all of the connections, including people who have only gone out one time, those one and doneers. They're going out with other people. This network is 949 different people. So lots and lots and lots of different people. So one of the really interesting things that we found in COAST, which is prevalent in hands-on citizen science and team-based citizen science, is there's a very, very social interactive component to it. We can actually look at those people in a little more detail, and we can ask some questions in general about demography. So let me walk you through this graphic, because it's a little bit hard to understand. It's got two collections of points. So the points that are in the upper part of the graphic describe people after their first few surveys. And the points that are in the lower right describe people a year later. So we're actually looking at a change in what? In the x-axis, we're looking at carcass specific accuracy. So I've already looked at that before. I already showed you that graphic before, but now I'm moving and I'm putting that on the x-axis. So that's how good people are at doing the work that we're asking them to do. And on the y-axis is participant persistence. How likely are they to persist from one survey to the next, right? And you can see here, what we've done is we've divided coasters up into all sorts of different categories. For instance, the red dots tell you something about their self-described level of expertise. And so what you can do is you can literally follow, for instance, people who are self-described experts. A year later, do they get better? Do they go out in the x-axis direction? The answer here is yes. And what happens to their persistence? So of course, people drop out, and so persistence goes down. So you can see here that experts are really good, but they do get better, and they are among the most persistent of categories. So it's good to have experts in a program. We can also see that elders, yellow are the age classes, elders start out less accurate than youngers, but they really dial it up, and they're much more persistent than youngers. So while it might look like it's good to have youngers in the program to begin with, a year plus later, you're really glad that you've got some elders in there. Gender and degree of sociality, which we measure as tendency to want to go out by yourself or go out with others, really actually makes little to no difference, at least in our program. But whether a new coaster has already participated in a citizen science program by the time they join our program really is a strong predictor of how likely they are to persist in our program. So a big lesson of this analysis is if you're already dialed into citizen science, if you already kind of know the ropes of what's going to go on and what's expected of you, you're far more likely to persist. And this is really interesting when you look at race and ethnicity and income demographics. So here are demographics of the US. So this is all people in the US. On the top is gender, just as by categories, either female or male. And on the bottom is the standard US Census race and ethnicity categories. And you can see that in the US, over the entire population, it's pretty much 50-50 male, female, not surprising, 77% Caucasian. What is it in hands-on outdoor citizen science? And again, we don't have a lot of data for this, but what you can see is a little more male than female, but way white. Here's outdoor physical science programs, even more male, but a smidge more balance in terms of race and ethnicity. Here's some very, very interesting data from a paper by Karen Cooper and others suggesting that when hands-on programs are very, very competitive, they have badges, people win prizes, it flips to over 90% male. So there's really a social interaction here that will influence gender dynamics. And here are online programs, also predominantly male, and just about as much Caucasian versus everyone else as physical science. So you can see here that we appear to have a large problem in citizen science in terms of who joins. These data are actually race ethnicity data from program managers, and we're asking them to tell us, is their program according to these various race or ethnicity categories, is your program all or most of these kinds of people, some of these people, few of these people, and none of these people? And what you can see reifies what I've already showed you from the literature meta-analysis, that most programs are saying, yeah, pretty much everybody is Caucasian non-Hispanic, right? And when you get to categories like Native American or Hawaiian Native or Pacific Islanders, which are a small slice of the country, they don't appear in citizen science at all. So it's white, middle class, and largely irrelevant to many audiences. So when we think about citizen science and public participation in science more broadly, some have suggested, and I agree, that community-based, community-driven citizen science, things that are place-based, that are in community, that are developed by those communities, that is science that matters, science that's interesting to people, science that's motivated by the concerns and the issues of the community, are going to, in fact, carry the day. So when we think about a place-based scale of these kinds of programs, from a shallow touch across many communities like eBird, and certainly like Coast, down to programs that are deeply embedded in a single community. And we also think about community strength, right? Programs that are started by a neutral organization and a neutral person, kind of like I am in Coast, down to those 90 communities that we work in, to programs that are started and maintained by a community member. We can put traditional science, citizen science up here with broadly based in space and hopefully neutral, that is not negative to a community. Expert or extreme citizen science, I haven't talked about this today. This is started in the UK, is a little more localized, community-driven science, but community-based science, community-owned science, participatory research is down at this nexus of owned and maintained by communities. So when we talk about citizen science versus community science, really the question is, can we get there from here? Can we have citizen science become community science, or should we keep the two separate? I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to leave you with it. And I'm going to turn to another question, which is relative to Coast, so what? And here the so what is not social, it's scientific. So I want to back out here to a meta-analysis that was published a few years ago looking at mass mortality events. So concentrated space-time mortality events where a lot of organisms die, so many in fact that normal people take notice because suddenly there's dead stuff everywhere. So every now and then in the terrestrial environment, we'll get a bird apocalypse where lots and lots and lots of the same bird, red-winged blackbirds, will literally fall from the sky and litter the local environment, and people will think, gosh, what's going on? And so you can see that birds here are one of the data sets, and bird mass mortality events are on the rise globally just slightly. And the question that I want to ask very specifically to the Northeast Pacific, which is my part of the world, is the marine heat wave that we experienced a culprit? Okay, so here's the Coast conceptual model with respect to dead birds. So we're starting with climate, that is the long-term patterns of temperature and precipitation and wind. And so climate on the short term is weather, but both climate and weather create the physics of the situation, both the atmospheric physics and the sea surface physics, that is where the water goes and how warm it is. And all of that pushes into a biology mechanism, AKA trophic transfer, right? That is, the physics of the system is really setting the conditions under which phytoplankton is blooming, zooplankton are surviving, and then on up the food chain into forage fish and upper trophics. So where upper trophics are in space-time, that is choice of location, is set by that biological mechanism. And so where they die is also set by that. But there's a bunch of abiotic forcing that goes on as well. And that is both things like extreme weather that are changing mortality probabilities, but also quite literally, as soon as that carcass dies, it becomes a drifter. It's basically no different than a plastic bottle floating around, a piece of marine debris. And so we can actually track that drifter over time. So basically where it dies is going to tell us something about whether it's going to end up on the beach. And that becomes really, really important when we're trying to do basic modeling of the number of carcasses over time. So here are the coast sites set by large marine ecosystems. So we're in the Northern California current large marine ecosystem, also in the Gulf of Alaska, and also in the Bering Sea, which has a large marine ecosystem, stretches up past the Bering Strait. That's where Alaska and Russia come closest together, on up into the Chukchi and the Arctic. Each one of these red dots is a sampling site. You can see that we're much more prevalent in the lower 48 than we are in Alaska. That's both because there's broad stretches of Alaska where nobody lives, and also because there are a lot fewer people there. So here's the basic coast data collected over space-time. So the graphic that I'm showing you is Northern Oregon, and on the x-axis is time in months, and on the y-axis is encounter rate, the chance that you're going to find a carcass in a kilometer of beach in Northern Oregon. And the black line and the yellow wash are the long-term average. So that's calculated by us on a daily basis as we get new information there. And the gray histograms are what actually happened amassed over the beaches in Northern Oregon in 2010, 2011. So you can see in that particular year, we got more than normal encounter rate. So carcasses per kilometer in October, November, December in the winter. And I've put a red circle on that same data because I can stretch it out over time, and then that long-term average kind of looks like an EKG or a heartbeat graph, and you can see do the gray histograms match that long-term average signal, and of course they do. They constitute it, but every now and then we have a wow out, so a big spike, a catastrophic spike, as you can see in the red bars here, which we auto label as 5x the highest peak in the normal time series, and they become catastrophic signals. This one is a Cassin's Auklet mass mortality event, and I want to actually dig in and tell you a little bit about this event. So the most important thing that COAST does in science land is to create this baseline and then be able to detect anomalies from it, these catastrophic signals, and then dig into that and work with a bunch of people to try and figure out causality of a particular event. So I'm going to tell you two stories, a data-rich story and a data-sparse story. So the data-rich story is about Cassin's Auklet. It's the one that I just mentioned. So there are about 5.5 million of these birds in the world. The center of their population is BC, where that star is. A huge percentage of the population lives on one island archipelago at the northwest tip of Vancouver Island. So they're a little bird about the size of my fist. Okay, and here is a infographic of the Cassin's Auklet mass mortality events. We call this a bullseye plot. The black circles are the long-term average, and the yellow circles, the bullseye, are the particular event in question, and that allows us to map it in space, which are the strata or the rows, and time, those are the months or the columns. And so you can see that this mass mortality event was centered in the December-January portion of the year, and around the Columbia River, so mainly in southern Washington and throughout the coast of Oregon, although there was a smaller, earlier signal that you can see here in California. So the measured beaching peaked at about 35 birds per kilometer per day over about 800 or 900 kilometers. So that's a lot of birds. That baseline, that rate is about 100 times the baseline. That's a lot. So we put together a set of hypotheses for what could have caused this big spike that you can see in 2014. Surplus production, maybe there were just a lot of chicks that year, and those data came from our partners at Environment Canada, that there was bad weather, a lot of storms that killed a bunch of birds, that there was a shift in the ecosystem, low production, a change in food, or that there was habitat compression, less cold water. Cold water is good habitat for Cassin's, warm water is bad habitat. And what we did was we could collect those data over many, many different years. So each dot here is a year. The red dot is 2014. And what we can see here is that there's this really interesting relationship between food and, in fact, bad food. Small copepods, a copepod assemblage, which is typical of the coast of California, atypical in Oregon and Washington. These are smaller organisms and they're less lipid rich than the northern copepod assemblage, which is larger organisms and lipid rich organisms. We can also see that there's a relationship with bad habitat. So when bad habitat or the amount of warm water in the place where chasms are dispersing along the coast increases, the chance of carcasses goes up. But these are log plots, and so they're driven by that point. So when you exclude the 2014 point, you can see that we still maintain that relationship with bad food, that habitat falls out, and there we have an influence of storms and waves. So basically storminess. So what explains the chance that we'll see chasms on the beach, that there's a lot of bad food in the habitat, that the habitat itself is bad, and that it's stormy in the winter. So we actually also looked at what would happen if we placed carcasses anywhere in the coastal environment. And here we used a sea surface trajectory model called Live Ocean, which is composed by Parker McCready's group at the University of Washington. And I'm just gonna put a Cassin's particle on each one of these triangles and start two simulations, one on the 19th of December and one 3 days later on the 22nd. I'm gonna let them run for 7 days. And every time they intersect the coastline, they're gonna get caught by the coastline and stop. Otherwise, they're gonna continue to drift. And you can see this spiraling pattern, and that's an indication of tidal signals. So the sloshing back and forth on a daily pattern. But I hope that you can see that when we release carcasses on the 19th of December, we get a very different response than when we release them just 3 days later. So there's a lot of very local difference in what's happening on the surface of the water. And so when birds are dying down to the day and where they die says a lot about the probability that we'll find them on the coastline. And we can take these kinds of models and we can amass them over the entire time period that we know we saw carcasses, and we can actually create these probabilities that if you died in a particular place, you'll make it to the beach. So that's a forward model, but we can also run that in reverse. That is, given the fact that we have so many carcasses on the beach, where were they likely to have started? And that's really important because that tells us something about the distribution of the live birds and also allows us to do modeling overall of how many carcasses died. And you can see here that all of those birds had to have been on the shelf, which is that line that's running through the middle of these maps. Okay, so what happened in this Cassin's situation? There was very, very warm, anomalously warm water called the blob, now called the marine heat wave, centered in the Northeast Pacific. And that really changed the whole ecosystem. So the prey of Cassins changed in size and also changed in species. So smaller, less lipid rich individuals, right? So the foodscape really changed for Cassins, but also the physical environment changed. So all of the Cassins auklets dispersed into this very, very narrow band. You can see it here in this map of cold water, almost all 5.5 million of them, we think. And that very small refugia of good cold water and good food evaporated at the close of the upwelling season in the fall, literally starving those birds to death. But all those carcasses were very close to shore. So those two things, the change in the ecosystem and the fact that they were close to shore, is what created that mass mortality event. So that's our data rich story. Now I'm going to tell you a data poor story. This is Tufted Puffins, also related to Cassin's auklets, a little bit larger. And this is the distribution of Tufted Puffins. And I want to alert you to one place, the Pribilof Islands. There are about 6,000 Tufted Puffins breeding there. This is one island, St. Paul, of the two islands in the Pribilofs. They're way the heck out at the edge of the shelf in the Bering Sea. Here are some photographs of beaches on St. Paul, and we've been there since 2006. This is a photograph that I received from the St. Paul Aleut Community of St. Paul Ecosystem Conservation Office. Lots and lots of dead birds of different types, very, very well arranged, by the way. Over this particular event, we saw 357 carcasses, so far, far fewer carcasses. But remember, we're looking at one tiny speck island in the middle of the ocean. We're not looking at the entire lower 48 beaches here. 76% of those carcasses were adult tufted puffins, and they came in at rates that are 60 to 70 times normal for St. Paul. We actually got a lot of information from the photographs that were sent in, including that about 95% of those adults were in molt. This species goes through a catastrophic molt. They lose all their flight feathers at the same time. And when they do, they have to stop migrating. So the normal natural history of this species is they finish breeding, they migrate to their winter range, they get there, and then they molt. And these birds literally didn't make it. We also know that about 75% of the birds were intact. This island supports Arctic foxes, and they eat lots and lots of things that wash in on the tide. So we know that there were so many carcasses coming in that the entire population of foxes on the island was literally maxed out. So a lot of indications of a lot of carcasses. So this is a data sparse story. We don't have a lot of data. It's just from one island. We don't have a great model of circulation. What we do have is wind, and we use the wind. St. Paul is in the center of these bullseyes to make some predictions about where the carcasses were surrounding the island, because we know we didn't get carcasses on St. George, which is the second island with the blue wash that you can see here. We could model that the carcasses had to have been within about 35 kilometers of St. Paul. And so that tells us that these birds were really surrounding that island when they died. It also allowed us to model how many died, about 6,800, which is more than 100% of the breeding population of both of those islands. Really catastrophic. And during that period of time, we also know that there was a sea surface temperature anomaly, very, very warm. So I've told you about two mass mortality events, Cassin's auklets and tufted puffins. Turns out there's a lot of them. And so we can actually ask this largest scale question about whether there's been a shift in mass mortality events over time. We can ask lots of questions. I'm going to just zoom in on some of them about magnitude, frequency, and taxonomic diversity. So this plot here, this is a ribbon plot. And on the bottom here, you're looking at sea surface temperature anomaly, or the shift from the climatological long-term average. So a gold stripe is higher than long-term normal, which we reset at 0. A red stripe is a degree centigrade above normal, and a dark red stripe is 2 degrees plus centigrade above normal. Okay, so this is the bottom is Central or Northern California, and the top is the Chukchi Sea. So we're basically marching up the Northeast Pacific on up towards the Arctic. And this is over time. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a circle for each mass mortality event that we have recorded from 2006 to present. First, I'm going to look at before we had a change in temperature in the ocean. So this is 2006 to 2014. You can see that there are a bunch of mass mortality events, but they're kind of small, they're relatively infrequent, they're taxonomically diverse. There are many families of birds represented here, and there's also a wide geographic spread. They're in California, they're in Oregon, they're in Washington, they're in the Gulf of Alaska, they're all the way on up into the Bering Sea. Now, what happened when the ocean started to get warmer? When you're seeing more of that blob, literally, of gold quickly going to red in the lower 48 and the Gulf of Alaska. So from 2014 to 2016, so a very, very narrow slice of time, you can see that the mass mortality events got a lot larger. So the circles are bigger, and the circles are standardized to the peak carcasses per kilometer that we're seeing modeled over each event. They're also very, very centered on one family, the alcids, and in the California current marine ecosystem through to the Gulf of Alaska. what's been happening in recent years? We see variably sized but very frequent mass mortality events. They're now centered on a different family, the Procellareids. Those are the albatross and taxonomic allies, and they've moved north into the Bering and Chukchi Sea. So what's going on here? And can we ascribe it to that blob or that marine heat wave, which really hit us from 2014 through 2016? So now I'm showing you a longer trace of that ribbon plot that goes back to 1982. And let me just reorient you. This is the blob or the Northeast Pacific marine heat wave that I've talked about. Really here, the ocean got stuck on warm. There's also a El Nino here on the backside of this event, making things worse. But I want to direct your attention to what's going on in the north. So in the Chukchi Sea, you can see that that warming actually stretches back quite a lot in time, at least to the turn of the millennia. So the northern reaches of our study system have been warm for a while. So this is a trace of the percent of ice cover in the northern Bering Sea. So that's the part of the Bering Sea that's almost up to the Chukchi. And you can see here that there's a really interesting pattern. There are stanzas of cold and warm in the Bering and Chukchi. And there was a cold stanza from about 2006 to about 2013, where we had a lot of ice, very blue in this trace, but it switched to a warm stanza where we have less ice to almost no ice. That would be no blue and a lot of red. If you look at the sea surface temperature anomalies in this same part of the world, you can see that there's a dramatic shift towards much warmer than normal. So in this part of the world, we don't have monthly sampling on a lot of beaches. What we have is a lot of community members in a lot of places that are giving us information. They might be photographs, they might be written accounts, they might be spoken accounts that are related from one person to another person to another person. Coast actually collects all of this information and we use it to create these maps. So it's a less quantitative way of looking at things, but it conveys the same amount of information. And you can see that there's a lot of mortality events being reported in the Bering Strait region, but also sometimes in the Bering Sea, Bristol Bay down here in 2019. So a lot of change in the Chukchi Sea, but you can also see from this trace that I'm going back to that there are, whoops, this way, some indications of warming before that cold stanza in the Chukchi and well before the blob. And we can actually use this to get a larger picture of what's going on. So within this box, we have really, really good coast data, and we can actually look at the influence of sea surface temperature on mass mortality events. And that's what I'm showing you here. Is there a relationship between sea surface temperature anomaly and the magnitude or the peak carcasses per kilometer of mass mortality events? And you can see that there is a relationship. Each one of these dots is a mass mortality event, but it's fairly weak. So we can see that there is a significant but weak influence of sea surface temperature anomaly on how big a mass mortality event will be. There's a stronger relationship between sea surface temperature and the probability of occurrence or frequency of a mass mortality event. And I'm just going to expand this graphic here a little bit so you can see that more clearly. Basically, what we can see here is that when the sea surface temperature anomaly gets to 1 degree C, there's a sudden step that we're seeing. That is, the frequency or the chance of a mass mortality event goes way up. So what we can see here is that there's a step at 1 degree, indicating that there's a non-linear or sudden response in the ecosystem. Basically, all the behavioral flexibility goes out of the system and birds literally fall out of the air and start dying. So over all of those events that we've seen recently from 2014 on, we're calculating that there's about 2 million and counting birds that have died in those events. So here's that conceptual model that I showed you right at the beginning. right, that both trophic transfer and abiotic forcing is influencing where birds choose to go as live birds, where they die, and the probability that that carcass will reach shore. And we have seen all sorts of different causalities. I've only showed you one of them, the bad food causality of Cassin's auklets. Oh, and the molt of tufted puffins, but there's a lot of different causalities that are creating these mass mortality events. I want to return to this question, the so what question. So I've talked a lot about the science, so what, but let's go back to the people, so what. So one of the things that coasters say when we ask them about the value of doing coasts is they talk about the data or information that's amassed over all of the coasters. So they're very, very vitally aware that they are one part of a large puzzle. And the puzzle can only be seen as a whole, as a picture with hundreds and hundreds of different people all collecting the same information, all of very high quality. And it turns out that this is important because they talk to others about what's going on. So this is a response to a set of questions about who coasters talk to about coasts. And the top graphic is people that coasters interact with regularly, like their friends or their family or coworkers or other people on the beach or their neighbors or people from other groups they belong to. And you can see that everybody talks to somebody. There's only green there. Sometimes they talk to them a lot, sometimes they talk to them rarely, but everybody talks to somebody about coast. On the bottom are people that coasters talk to less frequently, like communicators, people from the news media, or decision makers, people like politicians or resource managers. And you can see that most coasters never talk to any of these people, but a few coasters do. So somewhere between 20 and 40% of coasters talk to resource managers or politicians or reporters about coasts. So you might be a glass half empty person and say, hey, Julia, it's, most people are not saying anything about coast. That's not going to make any difference. But I have to remind you that we have trained over 5,000 people over the years that coast has been extant. So that 20 to 40% represents hundreds of people talking to resource managers or politicians or reporters. And their collective voice is a lot larger than mine alone will ever be. So here are 8 reasons that coast makes a difference. We work on climate impacts, harmful algal blooms, changes in predator distribution and abundance, fishery bycatch and fishery competition, disease outbreaks, marine debris, habitat change and population carrying capacity, and people, right? Because it's the people that are gonna make a difference at the end of the day. So I wanna thank the people who contributed to this talk, the thousands of coasters collecting data, all the participants in our programs to the south, Beachcombers and Beach Watch in California, and the many, many hundreds of Alaskans, including many Native Alaskans who are residents in those small coastal communities and participating in die-off alert. And certainly also the hundreds of coast undergraduate interns, which have gone unsung in this talk, but if we didn't have them, we wouldn't have coast. And so I wanna end by telling you that science is a team sport. It's not just scientists card carrying with PhDs out there, right? It's everybody out there doing science all of the time. And I leave you with this question: who's on your team? Thanks for listening.
Awesome, thank you, Dr. Parrish. So we have a couple questions in the chat so far. One of them is about a slide in particular, which is the recruitment, retention, and identity slide. So
let's see. Yeah, I got that. Let's see. Are the one and done group and the 1 year group answering this question at the same time? So for the recruitment, retention, and identity slide, they are actually different people because we did surveys at the same time. So we're actually surveying people at the training. They come in and we gave them surveys asking them why are you choosing to join coast? And at the same time that we surveyed those people, we did that over a year, so maybe 20 different training events. We sent a survey out to coasters that had been with the program for more than a year, and we're asking them why basically, why are you still here, right? And why do you participate? So that's how we're getting those answers for the what they're speaking about. For the slide about dabblers, that's the one that we put into the PNAS paper. There we are actually following the same individuals. So we're actually using the COAST data set. We record lots of information about all of the folks that are out there. So we can go into our data set and say, okay, we want to select a set of people who have been with us for just a year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, or all of the people who were just here for a small amount of time. Or we can look at all of the people who have just done 2 surveys and ask the question for that entire set of people, what's the probability that they're going to go on and do another survey? So of course, that set of people is larger than the people a year later or 2 years later. Hope that helps to answer that question. Let's see. I'm wondering if these findings are reflective of the participants' worldview or a change in meaning over time. Yeah, you know, it's a really interesting thing. There are 2 obvious sort of technical hypotheses. One is that when you join, there's a wider set of worldviews of people that join a citizen science program, and that those who are interested, motivated, remain, and they have a narrower set of worldviews. And the people with worldviews that collide or come into conflict with a citizen science program are the ones that drop out. So, and the other obvious thing is that people actually change. That their identity actually shifts. We have attempted to look at that by following individuals over time. And we have a very much more restricted and much more anecdotal data set about that. But we think we actually see both of those things happening. That is, folks join and they say, not for me, right? And because it's free choice participation, they leave. But we also are seeing shifts in people who are persisting. So people who start out that we follow over time actually do start to think of themselves more as parts of the science team defined broadly. And that's really empowering for them. And it's certainly empowering for me. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna just go forward, Angie, to Joseph's question, then we can come backwards. So what fraction of the Seabird Carrion pool flows into terrestrial versus marine food webs? Oh my God, that's a fabulous question. That's like, you know, the salmon and the bears stable isotope question. We don't have a good handle on that, except for really specialized cases like the Arctic foxes on St. Paul, because it's a very tractable situation there. And there we can see for that one really specialized case that beach birds are actually an essential part of the food chain. So carrion is an essential part of the food chain of those predators. What we don't know is in more open systems, so continental systems, whether or not this carrion is essential. What we can see is that on average, about 2/3 of the carcasses that coasters find have been scavenged, right? Which indicates that that there is that interaction. And when we get a mass mortality event, that percentage goes way down. So we also know that there are limits to that scavenger population. So one interesting thing, we had a mass mortality event of common murres. Those are also related to Cassin's auklets and tufted puffins in the Gulf of Alaska in 2016, 17. And that mass mortality event was very, very different than the others. First of all, it was huge. We're calculating maybe 1 million birds died. I mean, just a huge percentage of the Alaska breeding population. But the duration of that mass mortality event in certain parts of the Gulf was 9 months, right? So normally a mass mortality event is, you know, a month to 2 months. It's very specific in time, but this was stretched out over time. And so we haven't actually gone back to look at the scavenging rates for that event, because we suspect that that was so persistent that it may have actually changed the distribution of predators in the terrestrial system. And that is really, really interesting to think about. Let's see, I'm actually, Chris, I'm thinking that, are we in a cutoff here? It's 11 o'clock.
Yeah, so we'll probably take, like, if you're okay fielding the rest of these questions here, and then we'll probably close the questions from there.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to
Awesome.
make sure I wasn't going on ad nauseum. Let's see. So going back upwards, you incorporate human emotional science in your volunteer management. That is such a really good question. You know, we actually have been able to track that when a mass mortality event happens, we get a sudden downshift in participation. And people actually email us and say, basically, this event just eclipsed my ability to do the work. So normally, and this seems a little bit perverse, but I think I can actually explain it. Normally in coast, most coasters are actually pretty excited to find a dead bird on a beach. So that is not a stressful situation to them. One, because there's a lot of learning, and two, because on average, 2/3 to 3/4 of mortality on the beach is actually part of the normal cycle of life. But when these huge events happen and you're knee deep in carcasses, then there's a real shift, and people get very concerned and very anxious and very upset. And there we see a loss. And so we try and talk about that with coasters and give them lots of information, also give them lots of affirmation that they are doing amazing, amazing work, which they are. Without their data, we could not bound these events, or in some parts of the world even know they occurred. It is stunning, the quality and the value of the data that they provide. And that is something that they do like. Okay, let's see. There was a slide on demographic data of participants in citizen science. Could you share where you obtained that data? So all of the data that I showed, the demography data, we placed in a National Academy of Science report. It's called Learning in Citizen Science, came out in 2019. There's an appendix to that report, and that's the Demography of Citizen Science appendix. And it's a compendium of the literature meta-analysis and the program manager survey, and a separate meta-analysis that came from a platform called SciStarter. So if you want basically the state of knowledge of demography of citizen science in 2019, go to that National Academy appendix. Okay, let's see. Beyond identification accuracy, how are you thinking about other kinds of incomplete data in coast, such as sampling bias or spatial temporal gaps in data? And how do you think about this in the context of volunteer demographics? Wow, that's complex. We in our people-rich places, the lower 48, what we do is basically oversample in all of our locations, and we use a set of statistics to basically, you can think of it as a kind of a set of Monte Carlo analyses to get at what level of number of beaches within a strata, which is about 100 kilometers of coastline, we could go down to, but before the variability in the signal just becomes so large that we lose the long-term signal. In Alaska, that's really problematic because we're missing large parts of the coastline, and we can't get. I mean, nobody lives there, right? So we can't get them. So we actually are much more cautious, conservative about what we can say and about what those long-term or baseline signals look like. Up in Alaska, for instance, in the lower 48, we can parse things out by species. In Alaska, we don't do that for a lot of obvious reasons. And how do we think about this in the context of volunteer demographics? We don't. What we try and do in coast, and what we've always tried to do, is work in small coastal communities. We actually avoid large cities. And that's because while it's relatively easy to get folks in large cities, that's not where most of the beaches are. So we really try hard to work in coastal communities, and we try very, very hard to use social pathways in coastal communities that are relevant to them. So if we're in Alaska, we advertise via bush radio and the Family Health Service and the school system. And we work with teachers and community members and tribal government. When we're in lower 48, we work with newspapers. Excuse me, it's up in my throat. So we really try and cue into what is important and pathways that are important in a community. Okay, thanks. I have kept you guys way long. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for listening to me talk about dead birds on beaches and citizen science. And if you've got any other questions, I'm really happy to answer them. Feel free to email me. I'm at jparrish with 2 R's at uw.edu, or just look up COAST online, www.coast.org. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Dr. Parrish. It was awesome hearing you talk.
Cool.